Amelia Bedilia's Family Album by Peggy Parish. Amelia Bedilia, said Mrs. Rogers, you have been here a long time. Oh, Mrs. Rogers, said Amelia Bedilia, are you tired of me? Of course not, said Mrs. Rogers. We want to have a party for you. We want to meet your family. Now that is nice, said Amelia Bedilia. Who would you like to invite? Asked Mrs. Rogers. I'll get my family album, said Amelia Bedilia. You can help me decide. Good idea, said Mr. Rogers. Amelia Bedilia got her album. This is my daddy, said Amelia Bedilia. He is a telephone operator. Then he helps people make calls, said Mr. Rogers. He does not, said Amelia Bedilia. He operates on telephones. I see, said Mr. Rogers. This is my mamma, said Amelia Bedilia. She is a loafer. You mean she does nothing, said Mrs. Rogers. Certainly not, said Amelia Bedilia. She works hard. She makes dough into loaves of bread. That's what a loafer does. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. This is Uncle Albert, said Amelia Bedilia. He is a big game hunter. You mean he kills animals? Asked Mrs. Rogers. Why would he do that? Said Amelia Bedilia. He hunts big games. He has one so big it takes up a whole room. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. Next is Aunt Mary, said Amelia Bedilia. She is a bank teller. Then she cashes people's checks, said Mr. Rogers. No, said Amelia Bedilia. She tells everybody in the bank where to go. Some folks don't like that. I see, said Mr. Rogers. This is Cousin Kelvin, said Amelia Bedilia. He is a boxer. Does he win any matches? Asked Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedilia looked puzzled. Matches, she said. Why would he win matches? A boxer packs boxes. He gets paid money. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. Cousin Edward is a horse racer, said Amelia Bedilia. Oh, he is a jockey, said Mr. Rogers. I don't think so, said Amelia Bedilia. Cousin Edward races horses. He almost won once, but he tripped and fell. I see, said Mr. Rogers. Uncle Ned is a cook, said Amelia Bedilia. He works in a hotel. Then he is a chef, said Mrs. Rogers. No, said Amelia Bedilia. He is a doorman. His name is Ned Cook. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. Uncle Dan takes pictures, said Amelia Bedilia. What kind of pictures does he take? Asked Mr. Rogers. Any kind, said Amelia Bedilia. You really have to watch him. He will take every picture in the house. I see, said Mr. Rogers. Cousin Bee has a fun job, said Amelia Bedilia. She balances checkbooks. I wish she would balance mine, said Mrs. Rogers. She will, said Amelia Bedilia. She can balance 20 at one time. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. My brother Ike wants an orange grove, said Amelia Bedilia, but he has had bad luck. How is that? Asked Mr. Rogers. He orders orange trees, said Amelia Bedilia, but they all come out green. I see, said Mr. Rogers. This is poor Cousin Chester, said Amelia Bedilia. He is a printer. What does he print? Asked Mrs. Rogers. Everything, said Amelia Bedilia. We could never teach him proper writing. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. Cousin Clara is a bookkeeper, said Amelia Bedilia. She must be good with numbers, said Mr. Rogers. No, said Amelia Bedilia, but she is good at keeping books. She never returns one. I see, said Mr. Rogers. Cousin Ella works with clay, said Amelia Bedilia. Is she a potter? Asked Mrs. Rogers. I don't know any potters, said Amelia Bedilia. Ella and her husband, Clay, have a bakery, said Amelia Bedilia. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. Uncle Alf is a garbage collector, said Amelia Bedilia. That is smelly work, said Mr. Rogers. It sure is, said Amelia Bedilia. All of his neighbors moved away. I see, said Mr. Rogers. Cousin Susan belongs to a fan club, said Amelia Bedilia. Are there many fans in her club? Asked Mr. Rogers. Oh, yes, said Amelia Bedilia. You never saw so many different kinds of fans. I see, Mr. Rogers said. My niece Lulu stuffs olives, said Amelia Bedilia. Does she stuff the pimento in the middle? Asked Mrs. Rogers. No, said Amelia Bedelia. She stuffs olives into herself. I see, said Mrs. Rogers. The last picture is of Ollie, said Amelia Bedelia. He is my nephew. Ollie is our catcher. What does he catch? Asked Mr. Rogers. Everything, said Amelia Bedelia. Measles, mumps, colds, whatever comes along, Ollie catches it. What an unusual family, said Mrs. Rogers. Yes, said Mr. Rogers. Invite all of them to the party. All right, said Amelia Bedelia. She left the room. In a bit she came back. They will be here tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, said Mrs. Rogers. We can't get everything ready by then. What's to get ready? Asked Amelia Bedelia. Food, said Mr. Rogers. Now, Mr. Rogers, said Amelia Bedelia, my folks know about parties. They will bring the food. But Amelia Bedelia, said Mrs. Rogers, will there be enough food for everybody? Everybody, said Amelia Bedelia. I hadn't thought of inviting everybody. What a good idea. She ran outside. Here, here, she shouted. A party tomorrow. Everyone come. And everybody came.